kids. This is Mark Goldberg from UN Dispatch.
And it's Matthew Lee from Inner City Press,
So it's
inside the United Nations.
So this is
I don't know.
This is our festive holiday edition.
Oh, really?
I'm wearing a bright green shirt, and I have my menorah behind me.
Oh, shoot, I should be. I'm actually, I think I'm going to let it all hang out here. I'll say that for once, this may have occurred other times, but this time I can say on the record, I've been trapped in the UN for over 24 hours, covering the UN budget, which went all the way until 8 in the morning. So
wow.
to tape this Blogging Heads, I've stayed awake. I've drunk Red Bull. I've gone to the noon briefing and tried to get answers, and I'm barely awake, but can give it up for the Blogging Heads universe.
You are
what's been taking place.
On a 24-hour UN bender.
I'm on a bender. I'm on a predatory bender, and in fact, there were. I will say, I mean, just to get the lighthearted stuff, there were a few lulls. There was a lull. I mean, I'm not. It was there was 100, at least 100. Well, 180. Some countries were MIA, but there were at least 180 people, that had the same schedule, at least as of last night, where we went through it 1:30 in the morning, the budget committee. Then there were some beers, though. There was the Russian delegation came in with crates of Baltica beer into the delegates' lounge, and everybody and corks were popping. Not to make it seem decadent, it was actually the budget committee did a pretty good job, as we can get into.
So I guess the reason for your 24-hour UN bender is the budget battles. Why don't you sort of set the scene for us? Why have you been at the UN for 24 hours?
I know. Maybe I've made a mistake confessing it. I just thought it had to. It would come out anyway if I described the hours. It's sort of like, wait a second. But once a year. I mean, some people are somewhat cynical about it. And on this, I was all charged up to cover it. Once a year, the UN there's a final meeting of the UN's budget committee. It's always in December. It always runs up against Christmas. This was actually more of a sort of a political one than budget, because although it's a budget meeting, the UN's budget cycle is every 2 years. So last year they voted, some of approximately, $4 billion budget for a 2-year period. This year, these are called the budget add-ons, like special political missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and then also, as it turns out, sort of these reform issues, like human resources management. They created 92 new jobs in development, which is actually, given the financial situation in the world, I think people might find it ironic. Although hanging around all night and talking to these G77 developing world people, they were like, if the U.S. has $700 billion for bailouts, they don't have $25 million for new UN jobs. And Americans are free to ask to answer that question, no, I suppose. But they were contrasting the two. But they were also, and I think, just to what I found interesting about it is it's the one time of year where the UN Secretariat actually has to answer to somebody, i.e. the General Assembly, which votes its budget. So it's weird. It's sort of a grab bag, the issues on which the Budget Committee chose to sort of go to the mat, and there were secretariat people coming down in elevators from the top floors at 3 in the morning to try to make their case to either save some positions or take some insulting language out of the resolutions. If you want, I'll tell you whose ox was gored.
Yeah, so
not Al Gore, but
Yeah, why not? Maybe we can start with this. I read an interesting article in the Washington Post today by your colleague Colin Lynch.
That's correct.
And I'm sure you probably read the same.
I've read the article, and I'm going to.
And it essentially said that one of the jobs to be axed was a sort of special investigative unit that investigated corruption in sort of UN procurement programs, so how they get their planes and how they get their contracts. And the Russians were a number of Russian nationals and even a former Russian diplomat were targets of this corruption probe.
Sure.
And the article says that sort of perhaps, or the article suggests, I should say, that the Russians were behind axing the establishment we're arguing to axe the renewal of the contract of these investigators.
They were pretty open about it.
So why don't you sort of take it from there?
Let me take it from there, and I'll actually begin it with a sort of a new media critique of mainstream media. I think that article, I know Colin quite well, but that article is pretty partial. It's pretty clear if you read the article that the draft was leaked to him by the Procurement Task Force, whose leader was Robert Appleton of Connecticut, almost as an attempt. The leaker always has a motive, right? To sort of like make it appear that he's doing the right thing at the UN, cleaning up corruption, and here's this corrupt Russian delegation trying to make sure he can't be hired. The thing about it is it's a little more complicated, because the critique that was raised of this office, and it's not, the head of the office is Ingrid Alenius. She's the head of the Office of Internal Oversight Services. The critique, and it's one that I've heard from people that work in that office, is that as she prepares to leave, her term runs out in 2010, and there's already a move afoot to find a new Alenius. She's trying to find posts for all the Procurement Task Force people. Now, maybe the motive is that they're such great investigators that the UN can't do without them. But then, if that's the case, then you can find a legitimate way to bring them through the front door. What the allegation is, and Russia's motives for raising it may be bad, but it is true that Miscellaneous has been hoarding empty posts to sort of bring these guys in without any competition. So Russia is sort of, ironically, cloaked itself in the good government, but actually they're right on this one, as sometimes they are right. And the thing about it that got missed, and this is why I think that the story is partial, I guess is what I'd say, is that the critique's not really of the Procurement Task Force. It's of the running of the Office of Internal Oversight Services by Ingrid Alenius, and numerous irregularities, which have included her trying to get jobs for her own friends elsewhere in the UN system, have included, and this is one I can say, you've heard me be on a soapbox about the Lockheed Martin no-bid contract. The Procurement Task Force never investigated that. In fact, the critique that exists of them, and I'll join that critique, is that essentially they look after much smaller problems. Almost inevitably, the wrongdoers are from the developing world, or I don't know if you can put Russia in that camp, but the sort of naysayers and supposed bad guys in the world. It's not, and I think that's a critique that the office has been unable to sort of effectively rebut. Particularly, and maybe I'm biased in this, but that Lockheed Martin contract was a high-profile violation of procurement rules by a U.S. official, U.S. national UN official to a U.S. company, and nothing was done about it. And so that's why people feel, and that's not why they feel. They may just want to eliminate the office, but there's a critique that things are not quite as portrayed in the Washington Post story.
So you mentioned that the G77, which is sort of the block of developing countries.
Sure, 134 countries can't be wrong.
Right, 130. So the G77, which is like the 130 some odd country block.
Yeah, 77 is 134.
Developing countries joined Russia in objecting to this, to expanding the role of these investigators.
Sure, it wasn't. It's actually the nitty gritty is it wasn't even expanding the role. They have a very targeted resolution which says these posts which Miscellaneous, Ingrid Alenius has been hoarding in an attempt to keep the PTF guys on, sort of working around the rules, should in fact be filled. And Russia, after the vote, they did win that. They did win the resolution to that effect. They also added after the vote that they don't think these individuals should stay on. There's also, it's kind of one of these things where it's an interesting journalistic story, because there's also a critique of her office in Appleton as not allowing defendants to have a right to counsel, showing up at people's houses at 2 and 3 in the morning and interrogating them there. So it's sort of, I'll say that as a journalist, I've found from this, there's sort of like, I guess there's nothing worse than like people that think they're doing God's work, like because they don't answer any questions. Like Alenius, as questions have arisen about due process, about her own favoritism, has just shut down entirely. Never holds press conferences, runs away in the hallway, and it's weird because this is the office that's supposed to be about accountability. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyway.
In defense of of Colin Lynch, I think his article does kind of mention some criticisms. That of Appleton's.
Oh, it does. It does. I mean, we'll link to the article. So I'm not sure.
Which I think is not insignificant is the fact that his probe has uncovered. I'm looking at it. I just pulled it up on my computer now. Some $630 million in corruption. 25 million of which were just sort of in losses. So
he's been beaten up for that number. Yeah.
What's that?
He's been beaten up before by the UN for that number. Not him. I mean, I like him too, so don't get me wrong. I'm saying the UN, the irony here is that the UN, when that now Appleton wants to cite the 600 number to say, keep me on. But when you actually write an article saying 600 million of corruption at the UN, they say, no, contracts worth 600 million were tinged by some corruption. The actual losses are much smaller, and it's misleading. Jane Hall-Lute, the American official who contracted with Lockheed Martin, wrote a stinging letter to the Washington Post earlier this year saying that the 600 figure is so it's, actually, I may have gone off on the wrong foot.
This article makes it clear. I mean, the way it says that it says right here, the task force has unearthed corruption in contracts valued at more than $630 million, identified $25 million in losses, secured misconduct findings against 17 UN officials, and provided
it's a very carefully crafted
leading to the conviction of a senior procurement official. So I mean, to me at least, it seems like this task force is doing good work. That
Here's the irony here.
An example of the UN policing itself, or at least trying to police itself, and a member state, Russia, who happens to have officials that are sort of in the sights of this investigator, wants to quash the investigation.
I love the irony here,
Mark.
Mark.
Bad on them.
I love the irony, because now you're now the firebrand for rooting out UN corruption, and I guess all I'm saying is that the critique of that office is that it's not even-handed in what it goes after, literally. Okay, so we can move on, but I guess what I'm saying is also what I'm saying is interesting to me, at least, is that whether you like Russia's motives or Singapore was also involved, this is one time of year where people that otherwise don't have to answer anything to anyone are supposed to answer questions, and so. This is, and this resolution passed, I guess here's the weird thing. Normally you're the one saying the UN is great and I'm the one saying it has all these flaws. Now you're saying, oh, well, screw democracy at the UN. Russia has got these. I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but
I'd like to think my positions are a little more nuanced.
It's very nuanced. I'm sorry. I know. I'm looking for a fight after no sleep, Mark. But there were some other. Here's another really interesting one that to me again.
So let me. So what else? What else?
No. There were other. There were. I mean,
hours?
some of the things were known to be happening. For example, the U.S. called for a separate vote on something to do with the Durban II conference, right? That involved its anti-racism conference, but the first version of which was degenerated in most people's view into Israel bashing event. So the UN, whenever it doesn't matter how small the appropriation is, they're going to speak against it. So they called a vote to disassociate themselves from consensus on the Durban conference. They did the same on a conference to be held toward an arms trade treaty, where they said that as the U.S. they think that these conferences are a waste of money. They're also not signing on to the arms trade treaty. But here was a really interesting one, where there was a need to look at the budgetary implications of the work of a UN envoy named Terje Rod-Larsen, a well-known Norwegian diplomat who for years has had this part-time gig with the UN, where he is the Secretary General, first for Kofi Annan, now for Ban Ki-moon, envoy to implement Resolution 1559 in Lebanon. Now, what the Arab countries will tell you is that the purpose of that, his mandate is supposed to be to get Israel out of southern Lebanon, and they don't trust him further than they can throw him. Like, for example, one time Rod-Larsen went on a trip with Ban Ki-moon to the region, and various leaders refused to have him come to the meetings. Sometimes it's unclear why he's the UN's envoy if many of the parties in the area, in the region, don't want to talk to him. But the way in which this was raised, because the idea is that this is a budget discussion, it's not a political discussion, is that the Lebanon itself, and as you know, Lebanon is not the government, the UN representative of Lebanon is not only is it not Hezbollah, it's definitely the Senora sort of much more moderate side. Nevertheless, they introduced a paragraph calling for a reevaluation and serious sort of rejiggering of Rod-Larsen's mandate. And this is something where the U.S. and the EU were like, don't do that. And again, the majority of countries, about 80 to 55, said this should be reconsidered. So it's one of these things where, again, if many people, I think, if they look at the roster of who voted which way, would say, well, maybe the EU is right on this one. The thing that's funny about it is that it does seem that they should have to explain what the guy is doing. What I've run into with Mr. Rod-Larsen is that he works only part-time for the UN. The rest of his time he's the head of the International Peace Institute, highly respected think tank right across First Avenue. The thing is that it receives substantial money from Gulf states. And so what cynics say is that if he goes to the Middle East and takes anti-Hezbollah, anti-Hamas, okay, those are both two supposed terrorist organizations, anti-Iran positions, it's not right that his salary is paid by prominent Sunni royals, right?
You mean Saudi royals?
No, in fact, no, Sunni. I'm saying Sunni.
Okay.
Gulf states. They're very careful to say that this money comes from, Qatar, Abu Dhabi. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm using the word Sunni quite, and I'm not really. I have no bone to pick between Sunni and Shiite. I just don't think you can be viewed as an objective UN envoy.
So you're saying because I'm just trying to understand.
Go ahead.
So you're saying that because he also directs a think tank that receives money from Gulf states that he which are Sunni, that
needs to be disclosed.
Will not speak forcefully against Hezbollah, which is Shiite.
No. That what I'm saying actually is not even is that, for example, he's been asked directly. He's been encouraged by Ban Ki-moon, but he's been asked by the press to make this voluntary public disclosure of finances because of the appearance of a conflict of interest. I mean, my point here is not that it may well be his view, right? That the point is, if in your day job you're taking money from one of the parties of a conflict you're trying to mediate, at a minimum you should disclose how much money you're taking.
But
right?
I don't think I don't think the Gulf states are parties to the conflict in Lebanon. Other than the fact that they share a religious affiliation with one faction.
I don't know. Maybe I've spent far too many hours here, but I think that there are many people that say that the fight in the Middle East is one in which Iran is seen to be dominating, becoming much more of a regional force through its proxy Shiite militias, right?
Right.
And that the Gulf states, for strategic, not religious reasons, religious and strategic reasons, seek to combat that. Isn't that? I think that's the analysis. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying that that's a totally plausible analysis of why certain decisions are made and funding goes where it goes. So, and I'm back to the UN question. The UN question is, how can the UN have a part-time envoy whose finances of his day job, known to be over $400,000, are not disclosed? Why doesn't the UN have the gumption to say, if you want to work for us, you need to disclose your finances, as UN officials do?
And is that what member states asked in?
What they've asked for is a full it's not the disclosure game. They've said that there needs to be a report on why the work of this office has gone so far beyond Resolution 1559, and that passed. So again, and I almost, in saying this to you, I'm not really even saying. I mean, I think it was interesting. I guess what it is that through the year you see a level of sort of arrogance and unaccountability. I'm not at all defending the motives of member states that voted for that resolution or the one on OIOS. But it is, all I'm saying is, like in any government, it's called checks and balances. You know what I mean? Like normally in the UN system, the Security Council is the P5 and they're doing whatever they want in the world and trying to get resolutions that back up their foreign policy, right?
Yeah,
and then you have the Secretariat sort of freelancing, unclear who it's accountable to. And then once a year you have the 192 states, those who choose to stay there and drink Russia's beer, actually trying to call somebody on the carpet for whatever their motives. And so journalistically it's interesting, but also I think as a matter of good governance it's not bad either.
I guess I disagree with the underlying assumption you have with Larson's with sort of the strategic play behind Larson's institute's funding, that somehow the Saudis are seeking to, or the Gulf states are using him as a front in their proxy fight against Iran.
I think I went out of my way to say
marginal. I mean, everyone's trying to marginalize Hezbollah. It would seem that one of that any.
When you say everybody, who do you mean?
Well, it seems that any UN official or any international peace efforts that focus on Lebanon, need to marginalize at least the militant wing of Hezbollah and turn them into a legitimate political party if in exchange for peace. And it seems that's anyone will have to do that. And it just seems that, I don't know, it seems that you're making a big assumption.
Because you view things in Lebanon as pretty black and white, it means that no envoy could have a conflict of interest. I'm saying there's the appearance of a conflict of interest, and at least here was something that they're going to need to respond to. And
I guess it's not much of an appearance to me, I guess.
Okay, no, but let's veer, we're going to veer away from the budget for a moment.
Okay.
It brings to mind this is a new event since we last spoke, and I don't mean to be flip about it, but it raises the same issues. A heretofore stealth, unannounced UN envoy to Niger, Robert Fowler, former Canadian ambassador, major diplomat.
Yeah.
It emerged 10 days ago that he was the UN's envoy to Niger, which nobody knew, although he had been named to the post in July. It was never announced, but that he had been in Niger and was kidnapped, had gone missing. So immediately people said he must have been appointed to negotiate between the government and the Tuareg rebels in the north, and maybe those rebels grabbed him. And in fact, there was a rebel website that said, "We've got him." They've since said, "We don't have him," and it's emerged that where he went missing was in the southern part of the country, nothing to do with Tuareg rebels, and undisputed by the UN, he was that day visiting a Canadian-owned gold mine in southern Niger. Now, none of this is to say that it's not incredibly tragic that he's gone missing, but the problem is, it's pretty clear that what he was doing in Niger that day had nothing to do with the UN at all. And so the question has arisen, not like you can't change what happened, but what are the UN's rules when it sends envoys out? How does it choose envoys? And is there any focus on not choosing an envoy from a country that has a major financial stake in the country being envoyed to? But what do you do? Obviously, this is bad luck. It's very bad luck, and I don't mean to be flip. What the UN has tried to say about this is ask no questions. We'll have no comment on this. But the problem is he was in a UNDP vehicle, but he had no security, and the Canadian-owned mining firm has said, yes, he visited us on that day. Did it have anything to do with the UN? No. So I'm sorry to say that, but I'm going to go back to that, where it's sort of, what do you think of that? Because that a conflict?
I just want to get straight. So this is the first time I've heard about this mining. That sort of wrinkle in the story, but like you said, it is a pretty tragic story. That a UN envoy was kidnapped in the country, gone missing. No one knows where he is. The last time I read, I thought I was under the assumption that he was kidnapped by those northern rebels.
500 kilometers away, in having visited a gold mine that day.
I guess. So your question is was it a problem that he
who's running the show?
I haven't seen these stories, so I don't want to make.
It's all over the Canadian press. They've called the mine. The mine has said yes, they visited us. And again, it's one of these things where I guess it's like, what are the rules? And I think to me it's possible to hold two thoughts in mind. I'm certainly hoping that he's released unscathed, et cetera, but I don't think that it's credible and acceptable for the UN to say, they're basically saying, here's what they've said. They've said, please respect the privacy of the families. Okay, what was he doing there that day? Please respect the privacy of the families. Why didn't you ever announce that he was named? Please respect the privacy of the families. Why did he have a UNDP vehicle but no security? Please respect it. So these questions don't really have anything to do with the privacy of So then here's a better question. Generically, UN envoys, are they allowed to do national or private business while in the country with the UN laissez-passer?
You're making you're making like a huge assumption. Do you know?
Because the OCHA because the
was
UN
he working
OCHA
on a deal? I don't know that.
UN OCHA in the country has said he was not on UN business that day. A UN official in Niger has quoted that the trip was a UN trip, but the business that day was not UN business.
The trip? What does it mean? The trip was so.
He went to Niger. He called, according to one account, he called the Nigerois and said, "Can I come to your 50th anniversary?" And they said, "You can." And he went to the country. So the trip was a UN trip. That's why he had a UNDP car. But the day trip to the gold mine was not anything to do with the UN. And I'm not trying to say that he was making money either. It just has to do with. It seems pretty clear that an organization should have some rules or some policies or some.
It also seems that that sort of profiting from mineral extraction, is important for countries like Niger to try to, break their cycle of poverty. So it would seem that it is an important development
So if you heard that, for example,
and development, it's important to Nigerian development that the Nigerian people start to benefit from. And uranium is big in Niger. It's a big Nigerian
Absolutely.
export
and
as well. So it would seem
essentially
that we would want them. We would want Niger to start to profit from the richness under their soil.
We would, but isn't it the question is that the Canadian firms that are there, they're the ones trying to profit? No, I mean, I'm not saying that
they're clearly trying to
bad,
profit, but in a way that I think helps.
So
clearly that has.
What if it turns out that the UN that the UN said, okay, your mandate there is to touch on the rebels, but really to develop the mining industry in Niger?
I mean, what if it turns out? I mean, again, what if it turns out that he was on his way to talk to his, the Canadian mining company about ways in which that they could sort of promote good governance in Niger? You don't know, and you're making this huge assumption, I think.
Can you? I wanted to flip the script on you and say, if you were to hear and to know that the UN Development Program, in fact, helped develop mining in Zimbabwe for a political ally, in a mine owned by a political ally of Robert Mugabe, would that strike you as the UN doing its job of increasing the extractive sector to the benefit of people? Because that's true as well. Mm-hmm. And they've done the same thing in Niger, and they claim that this is it's a program that UNDP has since stopped. I think because it raises all kinds of questions, i.e., what the rebels say is that the current mining system in Niger entirely benefits the government and not them. That's why they took up arms. Mm-hmm. So maybe, I mean, again, I've told you.
I mean, that's kind of why. I don't know. I'm in the process of reading, and I would recommend this to everyone who's interested in the subject.
Sure.
Paul Collier, former World Bank economist, his book, The Bottom Billion, talks a lot about natural resources contribute to conflict traps in countries like Niger, and how there's sort of this cyclical and there's this symbiotic relationship between rebellions, poor governance, resource extraction, and countries like Niger are that the term he uses that sort of their primary commodity exporters. Right. Are fall prey to this trap and haven't gotten to the end yet, so I don't know what his remedies are, but it's an interesting and a highly recommended book.
Right. No, absolutely. That's a hard. No, and I mean, I guess I'm in a way I'm trying to look for a difference with you, but I do want to say it seems the irony is sort of like, well, I won't go back to the procurement task force thing, but it seems like in this case. I mean, again, maybe it's not you. You'll see in the Canadian press, it's very clear that it was a total side trip. I mean, when the UN guy in Niger says this was not our trip, I take that at face value, because it's in their interest to say it was our trip. And in fact, I mean, and this, I'm sure maybe this puts me in a bad light. As I've asked these questions and written these articles, I was approached by a senior UN official who said, it'd be better if you stopped asking this, because if it turns out, as it appears, that he wasn't on UN business that day, it's going to cost him his insurance. And that seemed like a very funny thing to say. Do you know what I mean? I mean, or maybe it's very real. I mean, I understand that, but it doesn't, that's not how, you decide what questions to ask. But, too, it's sort of like, I mean, I don't think the UN's, in the business of insurance fraud either. There's, disclosure is probably the best thing.
I guess there's also something, I mean, to me at least, it seems a little, I feel personally uncomfortable talking about this, knowing that there's a guy somewhere in Niger being held at gunpoint.
But the question is,
this person about whom we're talking, and really don't know anything about.
But I guess my question is to the degree that there's a problem. It's not journalists that got him kidnapped. Somebody had him there without any security driving to a gold mine, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess what we'll say is this, and then I promise you we can move away from this budget thing. I will say this. I'm willing to having seen how the UN Secretariat operates over the course of this year, I believe that their statement of stop asking about it is as much because they just want the problem to go away and because they don't have any policies and because they didn't know what he was doing at all. And even if he is released tomorrow, which I pray that he is, I don't think they will ever want to say what he was doing. Not because it was some super-duper, secret diplomacy to help the people of Niger. It's because it's anything goes over here. It's anything goes. And here's the example, the reason I say, and it's a much smaller example. All week, as the budget was being negotiated down in the basement of the UN spokespeople said, we have no comment. Criticisms would be made down in the basement by member states saying, why are they trying to eliminate the office of the Special Advisor on Africa? So I'll go up and say, what's your response? And he'll say, well, we'll have no answer until the budget is approved. Well, last night the budget was approved, and today the answer was, we have no answer at all. We're not going to answer. So, whatever. I mean, and so it goes. But at least that's, I think, why I think just not to be, at least those critiques, they had to answer it. See, look, we can go to a more real world thing, if you don't mind, Mark, which I think is probably all to the good. And I think we can even agree. I want to praise a UN product to the ends of the earth, and the product is the sanctions experts of DR Congo, who spent many months investigating, following paper trails, trying to get to the bottom of who is violating the sanctions in eastern Congo and giving weapons to both Laurent Nkunda and to the FDLR. And they issued a steaming 100-page report with photocopies of bank records, with names of banks, with phone numbers used to call Rwandan military people in Kigali, and they released it, and it's been an enormous bombshell. And nobody has really picked any holes in it. And it was like the best, since, at least in recent memory, I can say that's something like the UN really, and they did it better even than Human Rights Watch could do it, or International Crisis Group, because they sort of had subpoena power and they get a lot more access, but they did it. So let me just say, and if you, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this report, but it's a bomb, it's a killer.
Mm-hmm.
It basically says
this is essentially an update of and their first report that they did on this a few years ago was equally a bombshell when they uncovered the fact that I'm forgetting, coltan was that Rwanda suddenly overnight became a sort of the world's major exporters of coltan, which is not to be found in Rwanda, which is found in eastern Congo. So they have produced bombshells before.
Definitely, no, exactly, and I think that's why sometimes, because when you hear something like that, I sometimes think like some of these things, not they become urban legends, but I think there's another mineral right now they're saying is even hotter there, where it's sort of not an urban legend, but what's good to see is these people really nailed it down. It wasn't we allege or we think. They have bank transactions where big business people in Kigali gave money to Laurent Nkunda's wife, so that actually technically doesn't violate the sanctions, but it's pretty clear what's going on. So, okay. But in terms of the actual impact in the world, this is something where I can say again, it's not to I mean, Rwanda disagrees with it, or fundamentally feels that who is the UN to criticize them since they allowed the genocide to take place. That's right. The subtext. But since the report came out, the Netherlands has cut development aid to Rwanda. Mm-hmm. This has been and what they've said is that they're not stopping humanitarian aid, or they're stopping what they call direct budget support, where they up until now they've given a certain allocation of money just directly into the Rwandan treasury, saying, use it to back up your budget, we support you. Mm-hmm. And they have frozen that based on the report. I don't know what you think of that. It's sort of it's almost like kind of a unilateral sanction.
So that seems to be a real world sort of impact. Mm-hmm. What other findings stuck out for me from this report? I
think they also know, just because all we're saying is like to Nkunda, they definitely detail particular units of the FARDC, the Congolese army, which appear to be in league with the Hutu militia.
The FDLR.
Yeah, exactly. I just didn't. There was too many acronyms, so I was trying to. Yeah. The FARDC is with the FDLR fighting the CNDP, and
So they did find credible links between the armed forces of the Congo and the Hutu extremist militias.
And what's good is, what's good about it, because you can say, so then, I mean, in the UN, people try to, at least they should try to, but sometimes it's too mechanical. They'll try to do things like, it's a balanced report. It says both sides are no good. But in this case, they actually have the evidence on both sides. Mm-hmm. As you might imagine, one thing that they gave a briefing on it, too, which was all to the credit. They didn't just drop the report, but they actually came and the guy, answered questions about it. The issues surrounding possible... Well, two things. There were allegations that some of which were upheld, of peacekeepers being involved in certainly some resource extraction in the Congo, and even in one case, the allegation by BBC and Human Rights Watch is that peacekeepers, in this case from India, actually traded weapons with rebels to gain access to resources, and that's something that they have witnesses that they called Kung Fu and Dragon. It's a BBC expose, right?
Yeah.
That's something that, for whatever reason, and I don't know whether it's because the amounts at issue are smaller or because there's a conflict of interest, but the UN's experts did not look into that one way or another, which I think it seems unfortunate just on the theory of sort of like doctor heal thyself. Not that they should only focus on UN involvement, and obviously this would, to the degree that that happened, it certainly wasn't the policy of the 38th floor to, you know what I mean, extract gold or whatever. But I think it's, for the UN's own credibility, it seems like this is something that I believe should have been investigated. So that's, but, you know, they went their own route, but they did a job that was like, it's amazing, and especially, I mean, Rwanda has the resources, they put out a rebuttal, and I think, you know, it's, one can read it, and they try to point where, you know, leaps of logic were made. In one case, just so you know, the uniforms being used by Laura Nkunda come from Boston, Massachusetts, so there's a lot of, like, weird details sort of bouncing around.
That's actually an interesting wrinkle. How does that...
I don't know. They're certainly not Red Sox uniforms, but I'm just... Yeah, just joking. No, I mean, they just found, I guess, there's some details they throw in that are just so extraneous. Like, here's another thing that, I mean, these are findings that are just of interest. The FDLR has a website. Who knew, right? That genocide heirs can have a website. But they do. It's, you know, that's the world of today. These guys, the experts, contacted the server and said, you may be violating the sanctions by hosting their website. Now, the weird thing is, just to be devil's advocate, maybe it's okay they have a website. Wouldn't you rather know what they're saying? I mean, unless they're like, you know, especially they're not like a global movement. It's not like they're recruiting, you know, teenagers in Hamburg to join the FDLR. Unless, of course, they are, you know, Hutus in Hamburg. But it seemed, I thought it was sort of interesting that it wasn't clear to me why, for example, a server hosting a website would be violating sanctions, but banks like ABN AMRO and ING, which have transferred money to Laurent Nkunda's wife, are not violating the sanctions. But it was explained to me that Laurent Nkunda's wife is not on the list. So then, to come full circle, there was a flurry of activity on Monday, December 22nd, of, you know, extending mandates, and one of the things, they've passed they've renewed the DRC sanctions and this committee, and have created 2 new categories. They didn't put anyone new, including Nkunda's wife, on the list, but they've created categories of people who can be put on the list. One of which is people who block humanitarian access, and the second of which is explicitly, which wasn't on the list so far, people who are engaged in resource extraction in a way that helps one of the combatant sides. So that's pretty good, right?
That could be just about anyone, though.
No, I know, exactly. Yeah. I mean, actually, it goes back to, it could be, you know, I shouldn't say, it could be UNDP in Niger, right? Because if you're helping extract it, it's better, but, you know, I mean, when they say that, I think that they don't mean if you help the Congolese government, although maybe they should mean that since they are a party to the conflict, but they mean helping either CNDP or the FDLR, you know, the non-governmental wrongdoing.
That's fascinating, and we have maybe 8 minutes left.
Sure, go ahead.
I wanted to see if we could discuss this historic vote that took place at the General Assembly earlier in the week, or was it late last week? Which was which was a vote. It was sort of a non-binding declaration. I'm not sure what the precise terminology.
It wasn't even a vote. Not to be a smartass, but it was sort of.
There was a historic moment at the General Assembly where 60 countries agreed to decriminalize homosexuality.
Correct.
And said that all countries around the world should decriminalize homosexuality. This was put forward by the French government, who are the current presidents of the European Union, supported by most liberal democracies around the world, the Commonwealth countries, countries in Latin America. The sort of prominent among the standouts who did not support this resolution were the Vatican, the Organization for Islamic Conferences in the United States of America. And now the U.S. couched its reservations in sort of technical legal terms. The sort of the Organization of Islamic Conferences took a more, I think, confrontational approach. Took sort of the I don't know if you've been following this, Rick Warren brouhaha, but sort of took that kind of.
They went even further.
He equated. Well, he did. They equated this resolution with sanctioning pedophilia.
They actually used the word bestiality, by the way. Bestiality was in the early draft of the OIC.
Bestiality. Okay,
they went there.
So there you have it. So I'm kind of interested in hearing your take on this and what happened behind the scenes, because it seems to be a pretty momentous occasion.
No, it definitely was. Although the French Minister for Human Rights, Rama Yadeh, She put it in context. There have been in various international conferences. It's been building up to this. This was the highest number reached so far. But she harkened back to something done in Geneva where there were 55 countries. This was what it was. It was sort of competing rather than Egypt, Syria, and the OIC voting against the French one. There really was no vote. The French read out this thing and said that they had 66 signatories, and then Syria read out a quite contrary one and said they had 62. So I guess we can say the vote was 66-62, because the 62 were very much saying this has no place in the UN system. I think it shows, but the proponents went out of their way to say they weren't trying to impose. They were trying to say don't criminalize, right? And that seems. I mean, it's a pretty. What was interesting is that it was like, on the side of the there was an Egyptian draft that was equating it with bestiality. This dropped away probably all to the good, I guess what was unclear is not what was accomplished by it. I mean, I think maybe the French are right. What it is it shows that the number keeps going up, right? Clearly, it's an issue on which you can't say there's an international consensus. That doesn't mean it's a bad issue. It just means it wasn't like the attempt was for the UN to vote to sort of proclaim proclaim anything. But it was done at the UN, so it's clear. Again, maybe it's an idea. This is another good reason for the UN to exist. It's sort of just the venue, doing this in that venue. I mean, it wasn't, You tell me.
I wrote a post on Dispatch. I'll link to that I think makes that argument that sort of having that sort of clearly there's sort of like a long way to go on this issue, but I think a parallel, maybe like a parallel was the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which was first aired in 1976, and 30 some odd years later, almost 40 years later, actually, there are 180 some countries have signed on to this, and that has while it clearly hasn't eliminated discrimination against women around the world, it has helped to enshrine gender perspectives on debates within the UN, but also, broader debates as well. And I think this vote is I call this vote historic because I think it's a first step towards bringing LGBT issues into the fore of just into the discussion.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. I mean, I think I mean, not to be, and just sort of objectively, I think it's going to be some time before those 62. I mean, the U.S. I think it's as simple as an election. And the U.S. argument was that this is a matter of sort of for each state to decide, and so there could be no common foreign policy on it. But which, as you're saying, was a dodge. But I think that the level of opposition from some of these OIC countries is pretty high, and so it's sort of. But
I agree. It is.
Then you have to kind of flush them out. It makes them take a stand, and you see where they stand. I do actually want. There's two. Go ahead.
I just want to follow this thought real quick. It seems that again in the poster I say that one of the things that this resolution has going forward is that a number of liberal democracies are among its strongest proponents, and I suspect that the U.S. position will change on this. But and one thing as working at the UN that liberal democracies like to do is just extend their world of laws and human rights as far as possible. And like you said, this forces countries to take a stand on the issue. I think you'll see over time pressure will build for these holdouts to either continue holding out or, on the other hand, to sign on to some sort of anti-gay discrimination framework and get the benefits that are conferred by signing on to this framework, by being respected in other sort of international fora. So I think it's going to take a while, but I think over time the pressure will build and more countries will sign on to this. So I'm sort of hopeful, I suppose.
No, absolutely. No, I'm not unhopeful. I mean, I thought it was interesting. What was sort of, maybe it's just a fluke of timing or whatever. On the same day that this was taking place, across the street from the UN was a press conference by Sikhs who are using the UN infrastructure to sue France, or they call it sue. It's actually filing a complaint with the Human Rights Council, but France for not allowing them to wear turbans. And so this struck me as like, it's definitely apples and oranges, but it was sort of it was given that France was here saying like, it's human rights for all, and we're a leader in this.
I mean, this is like
I understand that that's a more complex issue.
An internal French issue.
Is it?
And I think I think the
Wait
typical
a second.
Wait, no, I'm talking about the
Why is it an internal French
French
issue? Whether people have a right to practice their religion or not? Why isn't that a human rights issue? I don't understand.
I'm talking about the French policy of laïcité, right, where they ban all sort of displays of religion in public settings and schools and whatnot. I mean,
but why per se is that just a national issue? I don't know. If there is a right to practice your religion outside of national borders, I'm not saying that you have to agree or disagree with the Sikhs. I just don't know why that's a purely it can be viewed, because obviously what Syria would say is criminalizing homosexuality is a national issue.
For the record, I think you should be able to display your religion. I think I'd take a traditional American approach to this issue. I think the French policy is I understand why they might think it's useful in a French context. I just think it seems to me to be a little and it's a very complex issue, and I don't want to oversimplify, but I kind of fall down.
No, exactly. I'm just noting it as I thought that France should have to answer it, but as they tried to say, it's totally disconnected. Here, and God forgive me, because it's such a nice thing. I'm going to as a final thing, just because it's I know I'm going to be extremely brief. It's the rare, bestiality follow-up. There was a UN, really micro scandal story this week.
I'm intrigued.
Over the last 2 weeks, where and I'll blame the New York Post for it, because I probably wouldn't have covered it otherwise. The New York Post ran a short, and I'm talking 170-word story. UN staffer was showing pornography and has been suspended. So I really, pornography is everywhere, and I'm certainly not even against pornography, but it was an interest, because of this, various people reached out to me and said, hey, the Post threw under the bus a low-level UN employee. Actually, there's people much higher up. They're under investigation for the exact same thing. So I was given a lot of documents, a lot of names. I was unclear whether to proceed. But I will say that it does, and it's sort of I don't mean to even say that it's funny. Yeah. The actual underlying OIOS investigative report on the individual in question says his defense was, yes, he was in the middle of the day screening pornography to room full of coworkers, but it was all straight pornography. So what was the problem?
That's kind of okay. That's there you go. That's a good follow-up.
I think it is. I thought it was.
Have a good holiday.
Okay. All right.
We'll talk again soon. Hopefully, we'll do a year-end roundup of the top issues.
That'll be great.
Which I think we teased at the end of our last chat, but
teasing
Matthew and I we're teasing it again.
I know. Is that a porno reference?
Yeah, right.
Sorry.
All right. With that, have a good one.
Okay.